A move to the right in Italy and Sweden. What does it mean for Europe and beyond? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Italy's election earlier this week delivered a historic result that could shake up politics, not just in Italy, but across Europe. A right-wing coalition led by the Brothers of Italy, a political party with neo-fascist roots, garnered 44% of the vote, and its leader, Girogia Meloni, appears set to become the country's next prime minister. Hermione Kitson has more in this report from Rome.
Signalling a seismic gender and political shift, Giorgia Meloni is expected to become Italy's first ever female prime minister.
It's important to understand that if we are called to govern this country, we will do it for all Italians, with the aim of enhancing what unites us rather than what divides it.
As expected, the right-wing coalition received the majority in both houses of parliament. The Brothers of Italy received 26% of the overall vote, outshining its poorly performing allies. Matteo Salvini's The League received just 8%, as did Silvio Berlusconi's Forza Italia. On the other side of the spectrum was a disastrous result for the Democratic Party, which received just 19%. The Five Star Movement came in third position with 15%.
Everybody wanted us out of the parliament. Everybody was saying that we were falling. The comeback is really noticeable. We are the third political force.
The snap general election follows the collapse of Mario Draghi's broad coalition government in July. Reflecting Italians' frustration with the country's political instability, was the lowest ever voter turnout at just 64%. Critics of the right-wing coalition say the political shift could jeopardise Italy's position in the EU and its stance on the war in Ukraine. While Meloni has always supported Ukraine and NATO, her allies have been criticised for their close ties with Russia. But political experts say, at least initially, Meloni will try to avoid a run-in with Europe.
As she has shown during the electoral campaign, she has changed her tone. She's trying to put her party in a more conservative stance.
The new government will inherit a raft of economic challenges: sky-high energy costs, rising inflation, record public debt and Italy's €200 billion share of the EU COVID Recovery Fund. President Sergio Mattarella is expected to officially appoint Italy's new Prime Minister by mid-October. Hermione Kitson, CGTN, Rome.
There's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Eleonora Poli is the Head of Economic Analysis at the Centre for European Policy. James McAdams is an international affairs professor at the University of Notre Dame and co-editor of Contemporary Far-Right Thinkers and the Future of Liberal Democracy. Also with us is Nicholas Michelsen. He teaches international relations at King's College London and serves as editor-in-chief of an academic journal on Central and Eastern European politics and international relations. And Cecilia Sottolotta is an assistant professor at the American University of Rome. She focuses on international relations and global politics. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. And Cecilia, let me start with you, and let's look at those numbers again. So, the right-wing coalition got 44% of the vote. The left could barely surpass 26%. And the one other figure I should mention was that there was very low turnout in this election at 64%. What does this election signify for Italy and the direction it's taking?
First of all, I would like to say that I wouldn't qualify the result obtained by the Democratic Party as a total disaster, in the sense that it was pretty much in line with what they got in the last election. And I wouldn't even qualify the result of Giorgia Meloni's party as a landslide victory. The reasons behind these results are to be found in Italy's electoral system. So the electoral system gives a huge bonus to parties that create a coalition and penalizes parties that do not create a coalition. So the left was divided, and we saw that actually the faster movement of the left side, which classifies at this point as a left-wing party, did quite well. But again, the Democratic Party and the faster movement were not allied. Hence, the low number of seats that they're going to be assigned. On the other hand, on the right wing of the spectrum, we do have a coalition, which means that they have a solid majority in both chambers of the parliament. And this is certainly an important development in Italian politics. We are witnessing the return to actual politics after some years that were perhaps characterized by this cult of technocracy in a certain sense, embodied by, in particular, Mario Draghi, the last prime minister.
Cecilia, what can you tell us about the leader of the Brothers of Italy party, Giorgia Meloni? She is expected to become prime minister. Here in the United States, the media is painting her as a far-right politician, a fascist, a nationalist. But there are others, like a columnist in the British newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, which said that her policy platform is in line with very contemporary conservative policies and thinking.
I basically agree. I think these things are compatible because at the end of the day, her party has its roots in neo-fascism. That's for sure. But at the same time, she's very well aware of the fact that that we are in a different era right now, and I agree. Her platform looks pretty much like the one of an extremely conservative party. So if there's all this talk about Italy going back to fascism, of course this is not the case. We are not discussing a crisis of Italian democracy. We are talking about a party that is certainly much more right of the center than what we've had in the past few years, but whose program is pretty much in line with any far-right populist party you find around these days.
Eleonora Poli, if we look at the situation in Europe right now, the continent is facing record inflation. In fact, in Germany, the inflation rate has just gone into double digits. It's trying to recover from the COVID pandemic, and of course, a lot of this has been driven by the conflict in Ukraine as well. The European Central Bank is scrambling to raise interest rates. To what extent have these conditions been pushing voters to the right in Europe?
Well, I think those conditions have contributed a lot. If you consider the case of Italy, I think the majority of voters supported Giorgia Meloni and the right parties, but mostly Giorgia Meloni because she was the unique party outside the coalition government led by Mario Draghi. So she was the one opposing the reforms, and she was the one that was able to campaign by opposing the government. And somehow she raised electoral support, Meloni, by building on social discontent. Social discontent that is not just Italian, I think, is European, which is based on the need to have decent jobs, decent salary, and also major security. And she was able to build, a sort of electoral propaganda based on identity, nationalism, and tradition that was very much appealing to many voters that somehow felt lost because consider that apart from the Ukraine war and the skyrocketing gas prices, we are also to consider that we came from 2 years of COVID crisis, and people are still suffering the economic consequences of such a crisis. On the other hand, the recovery fund that is coming from the EU has still not reached citizens, in the sense that citizens do not feel basically the benefits of European recovery fund at the moment. It's going to take longer time. So I believe that many of the right-wing victories across the EU are related to social discontent. That is not a novelty. If you look at Italy, already in the previous elections, the majority of the voters supported the Five Star Movement, which was an anti-establishment party. It was a new party, coming outside from the traditional rhetoric of left and right.
Right.
And then they supported also Lega, which is, again, another populist right-wing party. So this is not a new trend. It's a trend that has been building and building in the last years. On the other hand, the problem is that the center-left parties, I'm talking about Italy, but I think it's a problem of European center-left party, have somehow lost consensus from the traditional voters.
Right. James McAdams, you co-wrote or co-edited the book, Contemporary Far-Right Thinkers and the Future of Liberal Democracy. What does this rightward shift indicate to you? Does it indicate a failure of neoliberal policies?
Well, I agree with both of the commentators in their analysis. I think that, first of all, to call these parties neo-Nazi parties or fascist parties, I think it isn't helpful. Conditions have changed. On the other hand, I think it's important to recognize that these are not conventional parties. They're not conventional challengers within the democratic system. Otherwise, I mean, one could just look at the rhetoric and say, well, they're just like European social democratic parties, but they're not. And I think the accent of their leaders, but also the people around their leaders, is very different when they talk about issues like the nation, when they talk about national purity, when they talk about protecting the nation from immigrants. This is a very different kind of language, which can have important repercussions and really change what we mean when we describe these countries as liberal democracies.
Nicholas, what did you make of the outcome of the Italian election? Because it was back in June at a G7 summit that the outgoing Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi, he said that if the energy crisis is not reined in, then we will see a wave of populism in Europe.
Yes, well, I think there's no doubt, and I do agree with the other commentators, that there are links here to the economic situation. But of course, this is a process that's been going on for quite some time in Europe and beyond. I think the Fratelli d'Italia, they represent a wider body of political populist movements within democracies and indeed further beyond Europe that have quite a clear idea of the purpose of the state. It's not fascist, that's quite right. I mean, many of these parties do have fascist roots, but they don't have the same emphasis on race. In fact, they have a very clear and I think quite strategic move away from the language of race that is kind of off-putting for voters and also creates lots of international attention. They've developed quite a competent discourse around culture and birth, and this has allowed them to, I think, gather a great deal of popular support in many ways, blaming lots of the problems that the state is faced by on external influences. So the centrality of migration, of international rules, hindering the capacity of the state to enact the best interests of the nation, to be able to act in the best interest of those born as Italian and so forth. These discourses are quite widespread, right? They're the same. You see them in the Sweden Democrats. You see them in the National Rally in France. They're quite common, and I think they predate this particular economic crisis. Of course, they did emerge gradually over the last decade or so, linked to the previous set of economic crises. So there is certainly a political economic link, but I think the ideas predate this particular one.
So, Nicholas, does that also raise issues or put a big question mark over things like membership in the EU?
Well, I think Meloni in particular, if we're talking about her, has been very cautious to temper what was previously quite a Eurosceptic or anti-European position. So she's expressed very strongly pro-NATO narratives, particularly around the war in Ukraine. But she's also very much attempting to position the Fratelli d'Italia as a kind of pro-EU party. And I think that's a similar move to has happened with the Front National's move to the National Rally with Le Pen. I think this reflects, again, a kind of strategic learning, a nurturing of a more popular language amongst these new right groups. I think they've become very aware of the fact that Italy's position outside the EU would be challenging, and they have no real interest in pushing that point. It does have implications for Europe, and I think Europe is now faced by a fairly large or increasingly large number of states that have a quite distinctive vision of internationalism, a quite distinctive vision of what the purpose of international institutions are, and the centrality of the nation and national culture and the defense of national autonomy within that idea of internationalism. And I think that is going to create friction within the European system, undoubtedly.
Cecilia, there have been some comparisons made between the outcome of this election in Italy and what's been happening in Hungary, what some refer to as the Orbanization of Hungary. That's in reference to Hungary's leader, Viktor Orban. And this has been taking place in Hungary for some time. According to a Washington Post report, Orban has said that this is the turn of the anti-communist generation, which has Christian convictions and a commitment to the nation. Do you see a similar thing happening in Italy?
No, the short answer is no. I understand why this is the impression, because actually Meloni was always close. I mean, she expressed solidarity with Orban. So I see where this is coming from. But we have to be careful in comparing Italy to Hungary. There are so many differences, but also I think that we're going to witness very soon a change in rhetoric in Meloni's message, and Meloni's discourse in general, in parallel to what the previous panelist was saying about the repositioning in terms of how she sees Europe. So I expect to hear less supportive remarks vis-a-vis Orban. And I actually expect her to rather be or show her more solidarity to the Polish government. Let's remember that there are important differences, even across the European Union. And when we talk about political parties and governments, which are considered to be far right, there are important differences. And the Ukraine issue is obviously one of them. So Meloni now needs to reassure the public, but also her international partners about her intentions. She doesn't want to rock the boat, so to speak. So I expect her to, again, to be less supportive of Orban. And Italy's checks and balances in general, I would say, are much more solid than the Hungarian ones. One issue that we should pay attention to, though, in this respect, literally of checks and balances, is the issue of presidentialism. I mean, one of the issues that Meloni has been talking about in her campaign is the fact that she would like Italy to embrace a different system. Right now, we are a parliamentary democracy with a lot of constraints on the executive, and she quite dislikes that, evidently. So she didn't gain a majority that's wide enough to change the constitution without having a confirmatory referendum, which is another sort of mechanism to try and make this kind of reform very, shared and discussed widely. But we should watch that issue because she may forge alliances with other parties in parliament to try and push an institutional reform. In that case, maybe we could be a little bit worried.
Eleonora, on the question of Italy's relationship with the European Union, there was a little bit of friction before the election with Brussels when the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen warned Italy that the EU has what it calls tools if things go in a difficult direction. What did Italy make of a threat like that?
Look, I think this is part of a general trend. Like, there are two trends at the European Union level at the moment. On the one hand, there are those who are pushing for a political union in order to be able to answer to, international challenges together. And those who believe, like Meloni, that the European Union should be a platform for European member governments to cooperate closely. And this is part of these frictions. Like, von der Leyen was saying, we are here to protect, member states and member state institutions and democracy. While Meloni actually was answering that, she won, democratic elections in Italy, and, she will represent basically the will of the Italian people, the ones that voted for her, and the rest, of course. I believe, this discourse was part again of these frictions that will somehow determine the future of the European Union.
James McAdams, could we see this rightward shift in other European countries as well?
Well, I think we're seeing it throughout Europe. And, once again, a lot of the rhetoric of these parties and politicians is about economic conditions. They all say they're not racist. They're all defending democracy. But I think it's really important to emphasize, and you see this in countries like Germany and Holland, but also the United States, that when you start talking about nation, culture, birth, identity, this is a new element to democratic politics. And so even if somebody proclaims themselves not to be a racist, and perhaps they aren't a racist, even if they proclaim that, there are people who do have those instincts who will be very receptive to this terminology. And so when you think about Hungary, for example, Hungary is completely different because Orban is subverting democratic institutions. But where a lot of these groups have a lot in common with Orban is in using precisely this kind of exclusionary language.
Nicholas, let's talk about Sweden. You mentioned it earlier on. Sweden, we've also seen a turn to the right. An anti-immigration party won a narrow victory there. The Prime Minister, Magdalena Andersson, has already resigned, but she will remain leader of the Social Democrats. Let's listen to some of what she had to say.
The election result also shows us that the Sweden Democrats, with a big margin, is Sweden's second biggest party. And I know that many Swedes are worried. Many have already felt hatred and threats, and even more are worried about becoming a target and hesitate to express themselves in public. I hear your concern and I share it.
So what do you make of that, Nicholas?
Well, I think the traditional liberal democratic parties are extremely alarmed, and I think they're alarmed with, to some extent, good reason. There is an upswell, I think, of populist discourse within democracies, and as the previous speaker articulated, I mean, the narrative has some slightly worrying dimensions. And so the turn towards a language of birth and culture is very, very important in the Swedish election, because, of course, that election ran centrally on the issue with crime, linked to in the narrative of the Sweden Democrats to the inswell of migration. Of course, you'll remember that Sweden had a very, very liberal, open door approach to the migration crisis, and that created within Sweden a whole series of political shifts, and this is to some extent one of the effects, the way in which that process has been weaponized to some extent, or placed at the center of the election. And so that they ran their election very much on an anti-migrant platform. And I think you see very clear correlations between the way in which they spoke about the problem of migration. So that the narrative is that societies have a particular cultural form, and if you're born there, you have particular access to that cultural form. And if you're from somewhere else, of course, it's much more difficult for you to have access. And this allows you in many ways to displace problems within society on alien presences within it, right? And I think that's used not only in the context of migration, but also in relationship to gender, fears of the attack on the family in Italy that are quite central to the way in which Meloni situates herself. I think there's a very powerful story being told by these groups. I think it has quite wide reach, and it has quite powerful reach into society itself. And it doesn't lead necessarily to politics that we would consider to be highly democratic, or indeed, as the previous speaker said, ones that are not exclusionary. It tends to lead to quite exclusionary politics. And we've seen that in Italy with Salvini's politics previously. And in some ways, Meloni is an acceleration of those trends.
Cecilia, if we look at the election in Sweden, the leader of Sweden's victorious moderate party, his name is Ulf Kristersson, he spoke after the election. This is what he had to say.
I am proud of the confidence we have received, but also aware that others are disappointed. There is a big frustration in society, a fear of the violence, concern about the economy. The world is very uncertain, and the political polarization has become far too big in Sweden too. Therefore, my message is that I want to unite not divide. Look at what unites, but also respect real differences of opinion.
So, Cecilia, there's a lot of terms being thrown around, a lot of labels being thrown around, people being called fascist, etc. And I'm wondering, I mean, is that term fascist warranted, or is it just a scare tactic by the left?
I think that the left made a number of very important mistakes during these campaigns. And I think that insisting on this labeling operation has been one of them. This victory of the right in Italy can be seen really as much as a victory for the right, but also as a sort of a big loss for and the result of big mistakes on the left side of the political spectrum. The left has basically abdicated the right or to say anything that may sound like left-wing in the country. The left was basically, center-left, has essentially embraced the rhetoric, for instance, surrounding migration, right? The securitization of migration, depicting immigration as a security issue. That's typical of the right, and this is something that Meloni and Salvini have been doing during the electoral campaign. But the Democratic Party didn't really challenge this view, for instance. And in fact, the policies that are very harsh vis-a-vis, migrants, the policies that Italy has in this respect were passed first under a center-left government a few years ago. So I think that clearly, I mean, to go back to the original point, I think that really the divisive language is certainly a problem in Italy.
Right. Eleonora, I've just got a minute left. Do you expect any major changes from Italy in terms of its relationship with NATO or its support for Ukraine or, for that matter, its support for sanctions against Russia?
No, I don't expect that. I think Meloni was pretty much clear in sustaining that Italy will stick with the West. So the support to NATO and the US will stand. And of course, she agreed to maintain the sanctions against Russia. So I don't expect any change. The change that I expect to see are, in terms of migration policy, which is going to be harsher, and reducing rights for people of diverse backgrounds. That will happen.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us on the show. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arlen Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.